Hey there. Tonight, I want to begin with a drawer. Not a throne room, not a buried chamber lit by torches, not some impossible golden temple lost beneath desert wind. Just a museum drawer, sealed behind reinforced glass, resting in a climate-controlled vault where the air stays cool, the humidity stays obedient, and the silence feels so carefully arranged that even a cough might seem disrespectful. Inside that drawer lies a small fired clay figure from ancient Mesopotamia, no taller than a hand. She is a mother. Her body is plainly human. Her hips are broad. Her waist is defined. Her breast is lifted toward the child she holds. And the child at her chest, the infant feeding in the most ordinary gesture on earth, has the face of something reptilian. That is where we begin. Not with a theory. Not with a modern fever dream stretched across the internet like too much butter on dry bread. We begin with clay, with excavation notes, with storage numbers, with a figurine pulled from the deep past and preserved in the cold patience of a museum vault. If you stay with me tonight, we are going to follow that one strange image into buried temple layers, into cities older than writing, into the cultural memory that later fed Sumerian religion, and into a question that becomes more unsettling the longer you sit with it. Why would some of the oldest people in southern Mesopotamia shape family figures with reptilian heads? And why does serpent imagery remain so stubbornly alive when the Anunnaki enter written history? If you enjoy these slow investigations into deep time, leave a like, subscribe, and settle in with me. Tonight is one of those stories where the artifact itself does most of the haunting. Get comfortable now. Just enough. Nugrend hitual. Let the room dim a little in your mind. Listen to the hush around us. There is a museum quiet to this one, a careful kind of silence, the kind that gathers around very old things. The object rests today in the British Museum, catalogued, measured, stabilized, documented in the cool language institutions prefer when they are standing beside something that feels slightly unreasonable. You can imagine the labels: fired clay, height, width, excavation provenance, storage reference, condition report, curator notes. The adult figure's head is missing, broken off long ago, perhaps deliberately, perhaps in anger, perhaps in ritual, perhaps by pure accident. We cannot be sure. The body remains. Painted details still cling to her after almost 6,000 years. Collar marks at the neck, little bands at the wrist, traces of decoration across the shoulders and chest. Time has been cruel to the head, but oddly gentle to the paint. And then there is the child. Its head is intact. That is what catches in the mind. An elongated skull, large slanting eyes, a face that pushes forward into something like a small muzzle, or a snout, or perhaps a stylized serpent shape if you are being cautious. Though honestly, I have always found cautious language a little flimsy when the object itself is sitting right there in front of you. The infant is not snarling. It is not posed as a monster. It is nursing. It is held against the mother's side in a scene so intimate, so ordinary, that the strangeness grows sharper instead of softer. a monstrous pose would be easier, almost comforting in its clarity. But this is domestic, maternal, calm, which makes it much harder to file away. You know that feeling when something is wrong in a way that is almost gentle, and that gentleness makes it far more unnerving. This figurine has that quality. The clay is real. The dating is real. The excavation records are real. Sir Leonard Woolley recovered it in 1930 from the ancient city of Ur, or rather from layers associated with a much older cultural horizon beneath the later cities most people know by name. The notes describe the shaft descending through plano-convex brick and down into what the records call an antediluvian level, a pre-flood layer. Even that phrase has a chill to it. Pre-flood. Not necessarily because we must accept every old flood memory as literal history, but because ancient people loved placing significance beneath a flood, beneath a break, beneath the point where the world feels to have changed its mind. This object comes from the Ubaid world. That matters. The Ubaid period stretches from roughly 5,900 BCE to 4,000 BCE, long before the full flowering of classical Sumerian city-states, long before the famous royal inscriptions, long before cuneiform hardens into the written system most people associate with Mesopotamia. We are standing in a world before the world most audiences think they know. Before Uruk rises into monumental confidence, before king lists, before all the neat textbook categories begin behaving themselves. And already, in that deep clay-colored distance, someone shapes a nursing mother with a child whose head is not human. That alone should make us pause. Ancient religion often gives us composite beings. Certainly, human bodies with animal heads, divine creatures, threshold guardians, symbols made flesh. Egypt did it. Mesopotamia did it. Many cultures did. But context matters. The Ubaid figurines are not all grand, terrifying guardians looming over temple doors. Many are small, hand-modeled, intimate. They belong to a scale of touch, not spectacly. You can almost feel the pressure of the fingers that shaped the clay, the turn of thumb against damp surface, the tiny adjustments made before firing. Whoever made this figure did not create a great cosmic enemy. They made a family image, or something very close to it. And that raises the first serious question. If this were only some vague symbol of divine power, why this pose? Why a mother nursing? Why not a throne? Why not a shrine? Why not a creature in combat or some obvious display of supernatural force? Why choose the most familiar human act and place a reptilian infant within it? Some scholars argue that the scene marks divinity through bodily difference, that the reptilian features may signal supernatural status rather than biological form. That is possible. It is also possible that the figurine belonged to a cult practice now lost to us, or that it represented masked participants in rituals, or shamans, or deities whose visual language no longer survives in words. We should keep that caution. Old objects deserve caution. But caution is not the same as indifference. The strangeness remains. In the vault, beneath the museum light, the figurine keeps its silence beautifully. I sometimes think that is the most unnerving part of archaeology, not the dramatic discoveries, not the cinematic brushstrokes. It is the quiet confidence of the object after it has been catalogued, photographed, and placed behind glass. It does not argue. It does not insist. It simply remains. The whole burden of explanation belongs to us, and we are rarely as prepared as we think. Picture the vault for a moment. Metal shelving. Drawers that glide with a soft mechanical restraint. The low controlled chill of carefully managed air. A label fixed to the compartment. Perhaps a curator's hand lingering for a second before sliding the drawer open. The mother appears first as a shape, pale brown against archival padding. Then the painted bands. Then the curve of the breast. Then the child. And with the child, that slight inward pause that must happen even to professionals who have seen too much to be easily surprised. A very old object can still catch a person off guard. The mother's missing head almost deepens the mystery. Had her face matched the child's? Was the adult reptilian too? Some related Ubaid figurines strongly suggest yes. Others are fragmentary enough to keep us half in doubt. Here the broken neck leaves us with a human body and a reptilian infant, an image suspended between certainty and absence. It is like listening to a sentence with the crucial word torn away. The missing piece does not dissolve the meaning. It sharpens it. And once you notice that, the entire story shifts. Because now we are no longer talking about a single oddity. We are talking about the earliest visible edge of a pattern. The kind of pattern that begins in prehistory, survives cultural change, and later emerges in written religion wearing new names, new titles, and more formal theology. This figurine does not tell us everything. It tells us almost nothing directly, but it tells us enough to begin. It tells us that in southern Mesopotamia, before the age of written Sumerian myth, someone found it meaningful to depict serpent-headed or reptilian-headed beings in intimate human scenes. And if you were standing here with me, just beside that drawer in the museum hush, you would probably feel the next question arriving before either of us spoke it aloud. What, exactly, was inherited from that world into the religion of the later Sumerians? Because cultures do not begin from scratch. Cities rise on older ground. Temples stand on earlier shrines. Ritual language thickens around deeper habits of thought. The Sumerians, who would later write of divine councils, of antediluvian kings, of Enki, Eridu, and the Anunnaki, did not emerge into an empty landscape with untouched imaginations. They inherited land that had already been sacred for a very long time. They inherited settlement patterns, cult places, symbols, and perhaps memories whose original explanations were already fading by the time they first pressed signs into clay. That is where this little mother and child becomes dangerous to certainty. Not because it proves some modern fantasy. It does not. But because it sits at the edge of a long continuity that refuses to disappear. Serpent imagery does not flicker once and vanish from Mesopotamia. It persists. It deepens. It enters divine titles, myth, cult symbols, cylinder seals, temple iconography, genealogies. That persistence might be symbolic, It might be theological. It might preserve some older, remembered form of divine otherness. It might be all of those at once. The point is not to force a neat answer too soon. The point is to notice how early the pattern begins. And it begins here, in clay. The more I sit with that, the stranger it becomes. Not the lurid strange of cheap speculation, but the quiet kind. The kind that grows in a room with controlled humidity and glass partitions. A culture before writing makes reptilian-headed figures. Latte. A literate civilization rising from related ground fills its religion with serpent-linked divine language. Across millennia, temples continue to be rebuilt on ancient sacred sites. The line is not straight. History never grants us that kindness. But it is there. So let us step away from the vault for a little while and go much farther back, before the British Museum, before Leonard Woolley, before reinforced glass, before catalog numbers, into the baked air and temple soil of southern Mesopotamia, where the Ubaid people left behind the first visible clues. There, beneath later brickwork, beneath the orderly claims of written civilization, the older world waits in pieces. Fine buff pottery, dark painted patterns, settlement traces, irrigation, life, temple beginnings, and among them small clay bodies with heads that do not belong to any easy category. The nursing mother is only our opening image. She is not alone, and once the wider group comes into view, the vault drawer no longer feels like a container. It feels like a doorway, one narrow enough to miss if you are in a hurry, but once opened, very difficult to close again. When archaeologists first began cutting into the ancient mounds of southern Mesopotamia in the early 20th century, they were not expecting to uncover a civilization older than their categories. They hoped for temples, inscriptions, perhaps some tidy early chapters of known history. What they found instead was a deeper cultural horizon, quiet but sophisticated, spread across the land long before the great Sumerian names appeared in writing. The site of Tel al-Ubaid, west of Ur, became so important that it gave its name to an entire period. That period stretches for nearly 2,000 years. It is worth pausing over that time span. 2,000 years before classical Sumerian civilization fully takes recognizable form. 2,000 years before later scribes begin listing kings, copying hymns, and recording the divine councils we now know by name. The Ubaid people were not some crude prelude waiting politely for history to begin. They built planned settlements. They farmed with irrigation. They traded. They made pottery so fine and balanced that even now, in museum light, it carries an unnerving elegance. Thin-walled vessels, buff clay surfaces, geometric painted patterns in dark lines, restrained and deliberate, as if beauty had already learned discipline. This was not a primitive fog before civilization. It was civilization in foundation form. And yet what draws the eye most strongly are the figurines. At Tel al-Ubaid, at Eridu, and at related southern Mesopotamian sites, excavators found small, fired clay figures with bodies that appear broadly human and heads that do not. Some stand. Some sit. Some are fragmentary. Some preserve only torso and neck, but again and again certain features recur. Elongated cranium, large almond-shaped eyes, a narrowing, projecting face, thick neck. A reptilian impression so strong that even the most cautious museum label ends up sounding like it wishes the object would kindly become less inconvenient. It never does. The famous nursing mother is perhaps the most unsettling because of its tenderness, but it is not the only one. Other examples show female torsos with intact reptilian heads, their bodies decorated, their posture calm, their stance strangely composed. Some appear adult. Some perhaps represent younger beings. The features are not random distortions. They are consistent enough to suggest a visual grammar. Someone knew what these heads were supposed to look like, or at least knew the tradition well enough to reproduce it without hesitation. That repetition matters more than any single object. One odd figurine can be dismissed as whimsy, ritual exaggeration, or local eccentricity. A cluster of related figurines across sites and centuries becomes harder to wave away. The Ubaid world seems to have returned to this form repeatedly, and it returned to it without treating it as monstrous. That is crucial. We are not looking at scenes of panic or violence. We are looking at beings positioned within ordinary or sacred calm. Mothers, standing figures, domestic postures, presence without obvious threat. The imagery is strange, yes, but the emotional tone is often composed. I have always found that far more powerful than any dramatic nightmare figure. A monster at the gate tells you what it wants from you. A nursing infant with a reptilian face does not. It simply stays where it is and leaves you alone with the fact that somebody, 6,000 years ago, thought this image deserved to exist. So what were these figurines? Mainstream archaeology, being understandably cautious and usually allergic to melodrama, tends to describe them as anthropomorphic reptilian figurines, perhaps deities, cult objects, ritual figures, or symbolic beings. That broad category is fair as a starting point. Without written Ubaid texts, no one can quote the makers explaining themselves. We cannot ask them whether these were gods, ancestors, masked priests, shamanic visions, or something so culturally specific that our available categories fail before they even get started. Some scholars argue the heads may encode fertility, transformation, divine otherness, or liminal status. Others leave the interpretation politely open, which is often academic language, for this is strange, and we do not want to embarrass ourselves by pretending otherwise. Still, certain problems remain. If these are masks, why depict infants with the same features? If they are symbolic hybrids, why the repeated emphasis on family and bodily care? If they are gods, why render them so intimately? If they are ritual participants in costume, why shape the reptilian anatomy with such consistency? None of these questions destroy the symbolic reading, but they do prevent it from becoming lazy. And then there is Eridu. If the whole subject has a deep pulse beneath it, I think it is there. Eridu matters because it becomes, in later Sumerian tradition, the first city, the city where kingship descends from heaven, the city of Enki, the god of wisdom, Vater, and hidden things. But Eridu is not first sacred in written Sumerian time. It is already sacred in the Ubaid world. Its temple mound shows continuity over centuries, even millennia, with shrine after shrine rebuilt on the same ground. That means later, Sumerian religion did not simply invent sacred geography from nothing. It inherited it. It stood on older holy places and gave them written names. This continuity is not speculative. It is visible in the archaeology. Pottery styles evolve rather than break. Settlement patterns continue. Agricultural systems persist. Temples are rebuilt, not relocated. Whatever the Sumerians became, they emerged from landscapes already full of memory. You know that feeling when you walk into an old house and sense that the people currently living there are only the latest layer, that the place has habits older than their furniture. Southern Mesopotamia feels like that in this period. The Ubaid people leave behind sacred sites. Later, Sumerians inherit those sites, inherit the pull of them, inherit whatever stories or gestures or fears had already gathered there. By the time writing appears, the meanings may have shifted, but the ground itself is still doing part of the remembering. That is why the figurines matter so much. They do not survive as isolated curiosities in a cultural void. They sit at the beginning of a region that later fills with serpent-linked divine symbolism. Not proof, not certainty, but continuity. And continuity is often where the deepest questions sleep. The chronology itself sharpens the mystery. The Ubaid period ends around 4000 BCE. Then comes the Uruk period, when urban complexity grows and the earliest writing begins to emerge. By around 3200 BCE, signs pressed into clay start as accounts, tallies, grain, lavur, the dry administrative bones from which later literature will grow. Only later still do the explicit god lists, hymns, myths, and theological compositions appear in forms we can read with some confidence. So there is a long silence between the figurines and the texts. 2000 years, give or take. A gap so wide that it feels almost rude. We would love a smooth bridge across it. History usually refuses. Oral traditions change. Sacred meanings drift. Images survive where explanations die. And yet not everything disappears. Symbols can remain alive long after their first context has dimmed. A city may continue to worship at a shrine whose original story is half forgotten. A divine image may acquire new theology without losing its old shape. If you have ever inherited a family object with a ritual around it but only fragments of the original reason, you know the principle. Now extend that across civilizations. So when writing finally arrives in Mesopotamia, what do we begin to see? We begin to see gods linked with serpent imagery again and again. Not randomly, not as a passing decorative flourish. Serpents and dragons appear beside major divine figures, especially those later grouped within the Anunnaki world. They appear in titles, in epithets, in seal imagery, in cult animals, in cosmic genealogies. The Ubaid figurines do not explain those later links, but they make them harder to treat as sudden inventions. The old world seems already comfortable depicting non-human, reptilian-headed beings before cuneiform ever names a single god. That does not prove literal memory of actual reptilian beings. We should be careful. Some scholars argue the entire pattern can be understood symbolically. Snakes shed skin, suggesting renewal. They move between ground and underworld, suggesting liminality. They guard grain by killing pests. They inhabit water edges, marshes, cracks in earth, places that agricultural societies already view as charged. All of that is true, and it explains why serpent symbolism flourishes in many ancient cultures. But symbolism alone does not quite drain the strangeness from these early family figurines. It does not soften the domesticity of the nursing mother. It does not tell us why the reptilian features are so consistent across separate finds. And it does not tell us why later Mesopotamian religion keeps returning to serpent-linked divinity with such stubborn confidence. If you were standing here with me, in an excavation trench at dusk, the air cooling after a long southern day, dust settling on boots and sleeves, you might understand why archaeologists can become a little haunted by continuity. A painted shard here, a figurine fragment there, a temple rebuilt in the same alignment generation after generation. Nothing in itself shouts the answer, but taken together, they create a pressure, a sense that the later written world is sitting atop older meanings it only partly preserves. Imagine the excavators now. Soil baskets moving up from the trench, the scrape of tools against compact earth, brick courses emerging slowly, the shock of a small head appearing from the dirt. Not a human head exactly, something longer, stranger, calmly shaped. Someone brushes away the dust. The eye socket emerges. The neck, the line of the jaw or snout. It is only clay, and yet the room inside the mind changes. Another one. And later, perhaps at another site, another. In those moments, the ancient world stops behaving like a neat progression toward literacy. It becomes layered, atmospheric, difficult. A place where religion may have begun in images so old that by the time scribes finally named the gods, the names themselves were already standing on buried centuries of inherited belief. This is why I do not think the Ubaid material should be treated as a decorative preface. It is the first visible chapter of the atmosphere from which later Mesopotamian religion emerges. The serpent-linked divine world of Sumer does not rise from blank clay. It rises from clay already shaped. By the end of the Ubaid period, a lot is already in place. Settlement hierarchy, agricultural stability, sacred sites, art styles, social memory, perhaps mythic memory too, though that is the hardest thing to prove and the easiest thing to romanticize. We must be careful there. We cannot simply project later gods backward in finished form. The Ubaid people were not secretly writing Sumerian theology before writing existed. But we can say something quieter and more defensible. The ground from which Sumerian religion emerges is already marked by serpent-headed or reptilian-headed sacred imagery. And once you accept that, the next step becomes unavoidable. When the Sumerians begin writing, when they begin pressing language into clay and naming the divine forces that rule water, wisdom, kingship, gates, the underworld, creation, and flood. Do the old reptilian forms vanish? No. They seem to transform into titles, symbols, and lineages. Not always literal body forms. Not always obvious physical depiction. But persist they do. The old imagery changes clothes and learns to speak. So we are moving now from silence into language, from figurines that cannot explain themselves into texts that can, at least partly. The transition will not solve everything. In fact, it may deepen the mystery, because once the tablets begin speaking, they do not push serpent imagery to the margins. They place it disturbingly close to the center. The Ubaid people leave us clay bodies with reptilian heads. The Sumerians inherit their cities, their sacred sites, their temple grounds, perhaps even their old sacred habits. And later, in written religion, the divine world of the Anunnaki begins to shimmer with serpent titles, serpent epithets, serpent companions, serpent staff imagery, serpent genealogy. That does not force one conclusion, but it does demand attention. So let the trench darken a little now. Let the dust settle back over the broken bricks. Let the figurines return in your mind, un by un, their human torsos, their elongated heads, their quiet domestic poise. They stand at the beginning of a continuity we cannot fully explain, and that is precisely what gives them their power. They do not scream an answer. They wait. And as writing finally rises in the cities above them, the old silence gives way to names. And among those names, we begin to hear one title again and again, a title of honor, not fear. Great Serpent, Great Dragon, Ushumgal. The first written words in Mesopotamia do not appear like a revelation torn across the sky. They arrive quietly, almost shyly, pressed into damp clay for the sake of counting barley, sheep, oil, lavor, brick allotments, and temple obligation. It is one of history's gentler ironies that writing, which would eventually carry hymns, myths, prayers, royal boasts, and divine genealogies, begins as a tool for not losing track of grain. No celestial trumpet, no prophet wrapped in lightning, just a reed stylus, wet clay, and someone trying to prevent the storehouse from slipping into confusion. And still, that small, practical beginning matters, because once the signs exist, memory changes. What had once lived only in voice, ritual, gesture, and sacred place can now be fixed. Names stop drifting so easily. Titles harden. Theological relationships gain visible shape. The old world, which had already been alive for many centuries before writing emerged, begins at last to leave us its own words. And when those words begin to gather around the gods of southern Mesopotamia, the serpent is already there, waiting, not as a marginal curiosity, not as some decorative flourish added to a few obscure lines, but as part of the central religious language. That is the turn in the story that I find most difficult to ignore. The Ubaid figurines gave us silence shaped like reptilian heads. The written Sumerian world gives us names, titles, hymns, god lists, and liturgical phrases. And within those materials, certain deities are repeatedly linked with serpent and dragon language. The old clay bodies buried beneath the first cities no longer stand alone. They begin to feel like the earlier edge of a pattern that later religion will speak out loud. The most important title here is Ushamgal. The word is built simply enough. Ushum, serpent, dragon, snake-like being. Gel, great, mighty, exalted. Together, great serpent, great dragon. Already the air around the word tells us something important. This is not insult language. It is not a label for corruption or evil in the later moralized sense many modern listeners instinctively bring to serpent imagery. In Sumerian theology, at least in many of these contexts, Great Serpent is a title of dignity, power, and sacred force. It belongs to the register of praise. That should make us slow down. Ancient Mesopotamia certainly knew hostile serpent forms, chaos beings, dangerous creatures, and threatening dragons. The tradition is not naive, but it is also not simple. Serpent imagery does not sit only on the side of danger. It moves through wisdom, kingship, threshold power, underworld authority, fertility, cosmic force, and divine lineage. It belongs to the sacred vocabulary with a confidence that later religious frameworks often struggle to understand. And once the title Ushamgal appears, it does not drift randomly across the whole pantheon. It clusters. It adheres to particular gods. It feels concentrated, almost inherited. Some deities carry it or kindred serpent language repeatedly, while others do not. That uneven distribution matters. If serpent imagery were only a loose poetic habit, we might expect it to be more diffuse, more decorative, more casually applied. Instead, it behaves with a kind of theological discipline. Some scholars argue, very reasonably, that this discipline is still symbolic. Serpents shed their skins, so they suggest renewal. They move between visible and hidden places, so they suggest wisdom, secrecy, and access to the underworld. They inhabit marshes, river banks, and the edges of irrigated land. So in southern Mesopotamia, they naturally gather around ideas of water, fertility, and life beneath the surface. All of that makes sense, and none of it should be discarded. But the symbolic reading, even at its strongest, does not make the pattern less interesting. If anything, it makes it more so, because it shows that the Sumerians consistently found serpent form to be the best way to express certain divine realities. That consistency itself is a fact in need of explanation. And honestly, this is where the old Ubaid material begins to hum beneath the later texts, like a buried note. Because now the story is no longer this simple thing where prehistory gave us some odd reptilian figurines and then civilized religion moved on to more refined imagery. No. The written religion seems, in its own way, to continue inhabiting the same imaginative terrain. Not necessarily with literal reptilian-headed gods standing around in the daylight, but with a sacred language in which serpent nature still carries prestige. force, and divine legitimacy. Imagine a scribe in an early dynastic temple school or administrative chamber. The clay tablet rests on his palm or on a board. The stylus presses line after line. Around him there may be the low scrape of other hands working, the smell of clay dust and rushes, the dry warmth of Mesopotamian air entering through some open passage. He records names that have already been spoken for generations, perhaps much longer than he can imagine. He is not inventing these gods. He is stabilizing them. And when he writes titles like Great Serpent into divine praise, he is not behaving as though the phrase needs apology. He writes it as inherited truth. That inherited quality is one of the strongest things the texts offer us. They do not stop to explain why a particular god is serpent-linked, as if defending some startling theological innovation. They proceed as if the audience already understands. That suggests older roots, older associations, and perhaps older sacred imagery. Precisely the sort of thing the Ubaid horizon hints at. Writing itself deepens the problem in another way, too. Because once the records begin, we can see how continuity works across time. Cities rise and fall. Political powers shift. One dynasty replaces another. Languages intermingle. But certain sacred centers remain charged. Eridu remains charged. Certain gods remain charged. Certain epithets remain charged. The serpent language does not evaporate under historical pressure. It persists. That persistence should make any careful listener sit up a little straighter. You know that feeling when a detail seems minor until it repeats in room after room, text after text, century after century, and suddenly you realize it is not a detail at all. It is part of the load-bearing structure. Serpent imagery in Mesopotamian religion begins to feel like that. It is not always the headline, but remove it, and much of the old theological architecture starts losing its shape. This is especially true because the Sumerians were perfectly capable of using other animal imagery when they wanted to. Lions, bulls, birds, fish, all of them appear with specific divine functions. A storm god may gather bull force. A goddess of love and war may take the lion. A celestial figure may gather avian or radiant symbols. Mesopotamian art and language are not poor in options. So when serpent symbolism attaches itself so closely to certain gods, that choice feels deliberate rather than generic. It is also important that the texts do not usually present serpent identity as merely adversarial. The later habit of assuming snake means enemy would misread the atmosphere here. In many Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian settings, the serpent can be wise, ancient, regenerative, hidden, underworld linked, and profoundly authoritative. A great serpent title can elevate rather than condemn. That distinction changes everything, because it lets us hear the old figurines differently. A reptilian-headed being in an early sacred setting no longer has to be read as monstrous by default. It can exist within a much older and more complex sacred vocabulary, one that later writing will preserve in honorific form. And then there is the issue of time. The gap between the end of the Ubaid period and the first fully mythological written texts is large enough to make any historian humble. We are not entitled to a neat bridge. We do not possess some perfect explanatory tablet saying, These old figurines represent the early form of the gods later called by these names. That tablet does not exist. We are dealing with continuity of place, continuity of symbolic emphasis, continuity of sacred centers, and continuity of imagery. It is enough to be compelling, not enough to be simple. That is exactly the sort of situation ancient evidence loves to produce. Too much to dismiss, not enough to close the case. And so the story settles into a more interesting register. Not certainty, but pressure. Pressure from repeated association. Pressure from continuity. Pressure from the fact that when writing finally does emerge in the lands that inherited Ubaid's sacred geography, the divine world it records is not embarrassed by serpent language. On the contrary, it seems to honor it. This is where the old silence starts to feel populated. The figurines no longer stand alone in their museum drawers. Around them, slowly, the later written gods begin to gather. Great serpent titles, dragon companions, sacred staffs, underworld mediators, wisdom keepers, threshold guardians. The old reptilian form does not vanish into civilized abstraction. It becomes theology. And once that happens, we are drawn toward one figure more strongly than any other. A god whose name, lineage, cult, and iconography tighten the entire pattern until it becomes impossible to treat serpent language as background decoration. A god who stands between life and death, below and above, vegetation and judgment, and whose very body in art seems to confess what the hymns say aloud. Ningishzida waits there, already written, already worshipped, already carrying the old serpent memory forward into full religious visibility. With him, the pattern narrows, sharpens, and begins to stare back. There is another reason this written shift matters. Before writing, sacred continuity has to be inferred from foundations, rebuilt shrines, settlement patterns, and the stubborn survival of holy ground. After writing, continuity begins to name itself. Cities are named, gods are named, titles are named. The old world that once had to be guessed from fragments starts to leave a self-description, and inside that self-description serpent language feels inherited, not experimental. That inherited quality has a texture. Newly coined religious language often sounds eager to explain itself. Old sacred language usually behaves differently. It enters the line as if it has belonged there forever. The serpent titles of these Mesopotamian gods often feel like that. They do not read like decorative flourishes. They read like terms already understood inside the culture, which is precisely what makes the earlier Ubaid figurines harder to dismiss. One preserves a form, the other preserves a title. Between them lies a long silence, but not an empty one. We should also remember that writing in Mesopotamia grows inside temple and administrative life. These are not private fantasies. They belong to institutions, offerings, cult centers, and royal legitimacy. So when serpent-linked divinity becomes visible in text, it is already part of the organized, sacred world. That makes the persistence of the imagery far more important. The serpent survives formal religion. It survives administration. It survives classification. And that is where the question sharpens. Not whether the Mesopotamians used serpent symbolism. Of course they did. The sharper question is why it remained attached so consistently to particular gods, particular lineages, and particular sacred places. Writing lets us see that pattern more clearly, and once we see it, the old city gods begin leaning toward us through the clay with a very patient kind of strangeness. Ningishzida does not arrive in the Mesopotamian record as a puzzle. He arrives as a presence. That is worth noticing at once. By the time we can read him clearly in god lists, hymns, inscriptions, and seal imagery, nobody in the text behaves as though he is newly invented or in need of theological defense. He is already there, already known, already embedded in cult life. This gives him a certain calm authority. The scribes do not introduce him with fanfare. Kings do not apologize for his form. Priests do not explain away his nature. Ningishzida simply stands where he has long stood, within the divine world, and lets the evidence gather around him. His name is usually translated as Lord of the Good Tree, or Lord of the True Tree, sometimes shaded toward Tree of Life, depending on how one weighs the old Sumerian terms. It is a name that sounds fertile, rooted, quietly vital. Tree names carry upward motion and downward motion at once, branch and root, visible life and buried nourishment. Even before the serpent imagery appears, the atmosphere is already deep. But then the texts and images begin their work, and the god's identity grows stranger in a very specific way. Ningishzida is associated with vegetation. Yes, but he is not merely a field spirit. He is also a chthonic god, linked to the underworld, to gates, to descent, to judgment, to mediation between realms. He appears in positions of guardianship. He appears in roles of protection. He appears where the boundaries between worlds must be watched. This is important because it means his symbolism operates on several planes at once. Growth, death, return, authority, access, passage. He is a threshold god in the fullest sense, and threshold gods rarely remain simple. The serpent language around him is direct. A Sumerian composition addressed to him calls him a great serpent. Not serpent-like, not clothed in serpent imagery. Great serpent. The phrase lands without hesitation. It is a title of recognition. Other texts and god lists associate him with dragon and serpent beings, such as the Mushu and the Bashmu, creatures that belong not to harmless ornament, but to the charged visual world of Mesopotamian divine power. The atmosphere around Ningishzida is therefore not only botanical or underworld-focused. It is explicitly serpentine. At this point, a cautious reader may still prefer to remain inside the symbolic interpretation, and that is fair. Ancient religion uses bodily forms to express inner qualities all the time. A serpent-linked god might mean a god of renewal, hidden knowledge, liminal movement, and underworld force. None of that is unreasonable. But with Ningishzida, the visual evidence becomes so embodied, so physically specific, that the symbolic reading does not reduce the strangeness. It only refines it. This is where the seal impressions matter. Cylinder seals are among the most intimate forms of Mesopotamian self-presentation. A king, official, priest, merchant, or administrator could carry one on the body, roll it into wet clay, and leave behind a miniature world of theological order. Human figures approach greater gods through mediators. Divine hierarchy is staged with astonishing economy. In just a few centimeters of carved stone, whole religious systems become legible. These are not casual doodles. They are compressed declarations of reality. And in the case of Ningishzida, they become remarkably bold. The most famous examples come from the world of Gudea, ruler of Lagash around the late 3rd millennium BCE. A king whose inscriptions, temple projects, and devotional art survive in unusual abundance. Gudea chose Ningishzida as his personal god. That alone matters, because it means serpent-associated theology was not some hidden fringe concern. It stood close to royal power. But what matters even more is how Ningishzida appears in visual form. In the seal traditions associated with Gudea and comparable material, serpent or dragon necks rise from the god's shoulders. Not from the background, not perched politely nearby. From the shoulders. That distinction changes the room. If the serpents merely stood beside him, we might read them as sacred animals. If he held them in his hands, we might read them as ritual emblems. If they appeared beneath his feet, we might call them defeated creatures or subordinate powers. But when dragon forms emerge from his body itself, the imagery becomes bodily in a far deeper sense. The god is not simply accompanied by serpent power. He is constituted through it, or at least represented that way. You can imagine the seal impressions still wet, the rolled image catching light at an angle. A divine figure leading a worshipper before higher authority, and from the divine shoulders, 2 serpent or dragon heads curving upward with a quiet inevitability. The image is not frantic. That is part of its force. It does not strain to be monstrous. It simply presents this form as appropriate. Honestly, I think that calmness is what makes Mesopotamian art so unnerving at times. It does not perform horror for us. It assumes its own symbolic world is normal. The seal does not lean out of the clay shouting, "Behold, this astonishing hybrid." It rolls forward in total theological confidence. And this confidence is not limited to one odd artifact. Other seals and related images reinforce the pattern. Serpent staffs, serpents coiling around central vertical forms. Serpents integral to the god's visual identity. All of it contributes to a consistent field of meaning. It is not one artistic whim. It is iconography. Then the genealogy deepens the matter. Ningishzida's father is Ninazu, another chthonic deity, associated with healing, the underworld, and serpent-linked imagery. That means Ningishzida does not stand as an isolated serpent god floating alone in the pantheon. He belongs to a family line in which serpent association appears already established. The pattern begins to feel hereditary. One does not have to force that conclusion melodramatically. The texts themselves make lineage central to divine identity. And once lineage matters, repeated serpent traits within that line matter too. This is one reason the old question keeps resurfacing, even in cautious scholarship. Are we looking at symbols attached to certain divine functions, or at a preserved idea of a serpent-marked divine family? The evidence cannot fully answer that, but it certainly encourages the question. The gods' roles intensify it further. Ningishzida is not only a vegetation figure whose serpent traits might be explained by renewal and rooted life. He is a gatekeeper of the underworld. He appears in texts linked to descent among the dead. He also appears in heavenly threshold scenes, as in later traditions where he helps mediate access to the divine. Below and above, earth and underworld, life and death, petition and judgment. These are not narrow agricultural functions. They make him a being of passage, the kind of deity for whom serpent form becomes more than decorative language. It becomes structurally apt. You know that feeling when a symbol fits a god so well that it begins to seem less like metaphor and more like revelation. Ningishzida has that effect. And then there is the staff. In some depictions, two serpents entwine around a central rod or staff associated with Ningishzida's cult. Modern viewers inevitably think of later Greek symbols. The caduceus, the rod of Asclepius, the long afterlives of serpent-entwined staffs in healing and mediation traditions. It is tempting to leap forward too quickly, but even without leaving Mesopotamia, the image is powerful enough on its own. A vertical axis, two serpent forms rising around it. The whole arrangement feels like a visual theology of connection, below and above, joined through living, winding force. Some later interpreters have pushed this image into wild, modern territory. That is not necessary. The Ancient One is already potent enough. A god of gates, healing lineages, underworld movement, mediation, and serpent identity, carries a serpent staff. The image does not need embellishment. I have always found it telling that Gudea, a ruler obsessed with proper ritual, temple building, and divine legitimacy, did not choose some cleaner, more reassuring personal god for public devotion. He chose Ningishzida, the serpent-linked threshold lord, the god whose form could carry dragons from the shoulders and still function as royal mediator. That tells us something about the Mesopotamian imagination. Divine authority was not weakened by strangeness. In some cases, it was intensified by it. If you were standing here with me in the quiet museum light, moving from one seal impression to the next, from one transliterated line to another, you would begin to feel that the issue is no longer whether serpent imagery exists. Of course it exists. The issue is how central, how embodied, and how inherited it appears. Ningishzida's evidence pushes all three questions toward the center. Central enough to matter, embodied enough to resist flattening, inherited enough to suggest family resemblance rather than isolated symbolism. This is also why later debates about literal memory versus symbolic expression never quite settle down. Mainstream scholars, quite sensibly, prefer symbolic explanations because they are methodologically safer. Symbols are real. Theological metaphor is real. Ancient people did use animal forms to express invisible truths. All that is undeniable. But the persistence and bodily specificity of Ningishzida's serpent identity means that even a symbolic reading must remain robust and serious. It cannot become a lazy shrug. In the end, Ningishzida leaves us with a strange kind of clarity. He does not prove the boldest theories. He does not force us into fantasy. But he also does not allow us to treat serpent language as marginal background noise. He stands too clearly in the evidence for that. A named God, a worshipped God, a royal mediator, a threshold lord, a great serpent, a being shown with dragons rising from his shoulders as calmly as another god might wear a crown or hold a rod. And once he has taken his place in the story, the wider divine world of Mesopotamia starts to gather differently around him. Because Ningishzida is not the end of the serpent pattern. He is one of its clearest embodiments. Behind him waits Enki of Eridu, the serpent of wisdom and waters. And behind Enki waits the deeper genealogical darkness of antediluvian kings, flood memory, and primordial Serpent ancestry. Ningishzida stands at the gate, exactly where he belongs. And through that gate, the old question only deepens. There is something almost intimate in the way Ningishzida's evidence accumulates. Not one enormous proof, but many smaller certainties layered together. A title here, a seal there, a genealogy, a hymn, a cult object, a king's devotion, a god list preserving old associations without embarrassment. It is like watching a face emerge not from one bold line, but from repeated strokes that all agree with one another. By the time the image is complete, denying what you are looking at begins to require more effort than accepting its strangeness. And perhaps that is why Ningishzida feels so important for the broader Anunnaki question. He gives the problem a body. He takes the large, vague issue of serpent-linked divinity and concentrates it into one named being whose form, family, and ritual life are all preserved clearly enough to unsettle any easy reading. In him, the old Ubaid silence and the later written tradition almost touch. If Ningishzida gives the serpent pattern a body, Enki gives it a mind. That is the feeling you get after enough time with the texts. Ningishzida stands at the gate, beautiful and unsettling, rooted in underworld passage, shoulder dragons, and inherited divine strangeness. Enki stands deeper still, nearer the source, closer to the waters beneath everything. And when his name begins to surface across the tablets, the atmosphere shifts from ritual image to civilizational gravity. With him, the question is no longer only why a god might look serpentine, but why wisdom itself in Mesopotamia seems so willing to wear serpent skin. His city is Eridu. That name carries a hush of its own. In later Sumerian tradition, Eridu is remembered as the first city, the place where kingship descends from heaven before the flood, the sacred southern edge where civilization meets the watery mystery called the Abzu. Long before the great imperial capitals, before Babylon turns blue with glazed dragons, before kings carve their ambitions across stone, Eridu is already there in the religious memory. Low, old, marsh-touched, passion. Archaeology only deepens that impression. The excavated temple mound at Eridu reveals shrine built upon shrine, sacred architecture rising in repeated layers from the Ubaid period onward. The earliest temple is small, almost humble, but it sits where later temples will continue to stand. That continuity matters more than grandeur. It tells us this place was already holy before the written Sumerian tradition took full form. By the time texts describe Eridu as Enki's city, the holiness of the location is already ancient. You can imagine the place in its early life. Marsh light flickering over reeds. Channels of water threading through low ground. Mud brick walls drying under a pale southern sky. The smell of wet earth and silt. Fish scales flashing briefly in baskets. Priests or attendants moving through courtyards not yet monumental, but already marked by repetition. Already carrying offerings toward a sacred center tied to the waters below. There is something fitting about this, because Enki himself belongs to hidden depths, to intelligence that rises rather than conquers noisily. His domain is the Apsu, the fresh water deep beneath the earth. This is where modern readers sometimes make a mistake. They hear primordial waters and assume pure fantasy. But for the Mesopotamians, underground waters were not abstract. Springs, wells, marsh upwelling, river behavior, the strange life of the delta. All of this gave the idea weight. The world below the soil was alive with water. Water rose. Water disappeared. Water returned. The Apsu was mythic. Yes, but it was also experientially real. It was part of how the land behaved. And Enki belonged to it. In hymn after hymn, in myth after myth, he appears as god of wisdom, fresh water, craft, ordering intelligence, cunning solutions, ritual knowledge, and the arts that make civilization possible. If another deity rules through decree, Enki rules through understanding. If another god breaks a problem with force, Enki slips around it, reworks it, finds the angle no one else noticed. He feels almost modern in that way, which is perhaps why he lingers so strongly in the imagination. He is the god who knows how things work. And he, too, is called Great Serpent. This is not an occasional side note. It is part of his sacred language. The same tidal world that gave us Ningishida's serpent identity rises around Enki as well. And once that happens, the old pattern takes on greater force. Because Enki is not peripheral deity. He is one of the great theological centers of Mesopotamian religion. A god of deep intelligence, cosmic administration, and human survival. When serpent language gathers around him, it gathers around the very architecture of civilization itself. That is where the story becomes difficult to dismiss. The composition often called Enki and the World Order presents him not as vague water spirit, but as the organizer of existence. He regulates rivers. He assigns functions. He distributes domains. He establishes patterns of life and labor. He is, in a soft Mesopotamian way, a cosmic administrator. One can almost picture him surrounded not by chaos, but by lists. There is something almost funny about that. The deep serpent of the waters is also the being making sure the universe has been filed correctly. Yet beneath that dry orderliness runs a more charged current. Enki is also the keeper of hidden knowledge, the holder of the me, the divine powers and structures that underwrite civilization, kingship, crafts, ritual offices, music, writing, law, social forms. These things cluster around him. He possesses them before they are distributed. He guards the source before the source is shared. Here, the serpent association begins to feel less ornamental and more intimate. A god of concealed wisdom, dwelling beneath the visible world, channeling power upward from hidden waters into human order. If you were trying to design being around the ancient symbolic charge of serpents, you might end here. But Mesopotamian theology does not design him symbolically from the outside. It receives him already shaped. That is the important difference. And then there is the old mythic pattern of knowledge given, or stolen, or passed upward. In one famous Sumerian narrative, Inanna goes to Eridu and obtains the me from Enki through a mixture of charm, ritual circumstance, and cunning timing. Civilization itself seems movable in that story, something that can be transferred through divine drama. Enki holds it first. Others receive it through interaction with him. He is origin, reservoir, depth. Even when he loses from a position of prior possession. That same mood appears in other traditions surrounding him. He is the god who knows how to create, the god who knows how to preserve, the god who knows how to circumvent destruction when harsher divine powers decide humanity has become troublesome. This is where flood memory enters. In the Mesopotamian flood traditions, whether in Sumerian forms or later Akkadian retellings, Enki is the one who preserves humanity through knowledge. Another god may decree destruction, often Enlil in these narratives, irritated by human noise, excess, or disorder. Enki responds not by open rebellion, but by intelligence. A warning passed through indirect speech. A wall addressed so that human may overhear. Instructions given with plausible deniability, as if divine loopholes were one of his favorite inventions. It is difficult not to smile at the audacity of it. The fate of humanity may hang in the balance. And Enki solves the crisis the way a brilliant old official solves an impossible legal problem. He obeys and disobeys at the same time. This role ties wisdom to salvation. He does not save humanity with brute strength. He saves through foreknowledge, language, and the transfer of practical instruction. Build this. Gather that. Prepare now. The flood will come. Knowledge becomes life. The being who brings that knowledge stands in tension with harsher celestial decree. It is one of the oldest and most durable religious dramas in the region. And in Mesopotamia, it belongs unmistakably to God with serpent titles. You can see why later comparisons with Eden have been irresistible. We should be cautious here. It is debated, and the transmission routes between Mesopotamian myth and the Hebrew Bible are complex, layered, and not always recoverable in precise detail. Still, the parallels deserve quiet acknowledgement. A sacred place, forbidden or protected knowledge, a serpent-linked figure or serpent presence associated with the transfer of that knowledge, the resulting change in human condition. These patterns do not prove direct equivalence, but they do place Enki in a larger, ancient conversation about wisdom, restriction, and the dangerous gift of understanding. If the Hebrew serpent eventually becomes moralized into deception, the Mesopotamian background is more ambiguous, older, and in some ways more unsettling. Enki is not simply villain or benefactor. He is the divine intelligence that moves beneath prohibition, the source from which human culture repeatedly receives what it needs in order to continue. He gives, protects, organizes, subverts, and survives every theological system placed around him. And the serpent staff belongs in this world as well. Iconographically, Enki is sometimes shown with streams of water flowing from his shoulders, often populated by fish, which is itself beautiful image of God, so saturated with his domain that it pours from him. In other traditions and related visual lines, serpent staff imagery surrounds the same theological field. The later caduceus and healing rod comparisons are tempting. What matters most within Mesopotamia is the visual logic. Serpents rising around a staff, vertical channel connecting depths to surface, hidden knowledge ascending into visible order. Even if one resists over-interpretation, the image breathes the same atmosphere as Enki himself. Deep, coiled, controlled, alive with concealed intelligence. I've always found it strange that people sometimes speak of ancient religion as though it were primitive simply because it was old. Nothing about Enki feels primitive. Ancien, yes. River old. Marsh old. Tablet old. But his theology is sophisticated in a way that still feels sharp. He governs systems. He mediates knowledge. He saves through information. He is associated with serpent force not because the culture ran out of symbols, but because serpent form carried precisely the right mixture of depth, ambiguity, danger, intelligence, regeneration, and underworld adjacency. And once again, the older Ubaid world begins to whisper behind all of this. Because Eridu, his city, does not begin with cuneiform. Its sacredness extends downward into the pre-literate layers. That means the great serpent of wisdom is attached to a place whose holiness predates the surviving texts by centuries, and indeed by millennia, if one follows the full temple sequence backward. The written Enki may be Sumerian in name, but the sacred ground beneath him is older than Sumerian writing, older than the formal god lists, older than the myths in the forms that reach us now. Enki sits at the meeting point of sacred continuity and explicit written theology. Between them, the serpent title remains. Some scholars are content to say that serpent imagery is simply the most suitable symbolic register for the hidden, watery, regenerative, and wisdom-bearing powers associated with Enki. That may be true. Others, outside mainstream caution, prefer to say the imagery preserves a more literal, remembered nature. We cannot settle that cleanly from the evidence. But we can say something firm. The association is central, ancien, and repeated. It is not late embellishment. It belongs close to the heart of how this god was understood. So now the pattern stretches wider, from Ubaid figurines to serpent titles, from Ningishzida's shoulder dragons to Enki's waters of wisdom. From buried temple continuity to flood memory and knowledge passed upward through divine cunning. The Anunnaki world is beginning to look less like set of isolated myths and more like family of related sacred forms in which serpent identity, whether symbolic, inherited, or remembered, sits very near the center. And once Enki has entered fully, the entire theology starts leaning backward toward older questions, toward antediluvian kingship, toward the first city, toward the claim that before the flood, in Eridu, something descended from heaven into world already watched by the great serpent of the waters. That is where the old calm begins to darken again. If Enki is the mind of the serpent pattern, then Eridu is its room. There is something almost dreamlike about the way the city appears in Mesopotamian memory. Not dreamlike because it is vague, but because it stands at the point where history, theology, and time begin to blur at the edges. Later texts remember it as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven before the flood. Archaeology remembers it as sacred mound whose temple sequence reaches back into the Ubaid world. Religious tradition remembers it as the city of Enki, lord of the Apsu, keeper of wisdom, great serpent of the waters. All three memories converge in one place, and when they do, the atmosphere becomes difficult to ignore. The Sumerian king list opens with line that seems simple until you sit with it for too long. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Kingship is not invented by clever humans in this vision of the world. It descends into specific city, and that city is Enki's. Then the impossible reigns begin. Alulim, Alaulgar, tens of thousands of years. Durations so vast that even the most patient reader starts to feel the numbers becoming symbolic before the text has finished speaking them. Mainstream scholarship is surely right that these are not historical reign lengths in any ordinary sense. They may be theological numbers, sexagesimal exaggerations, expressions of primordial antiquity, or stylized way of marking time closer to the gods than to measurable human history. We cannot be sure of the original logic behind them. But whatever the arithmetic means, the placement means more. The first kings rule in Eridu, and Eridu belongs to Enki. That is where the serpent pattern begins to bend toward kingship itself. If the first city is Enki's city, and the first kingship descends there, then divine authority enters human order through sacred geography already marked by serpent-linked divinity. This does not prove reptilian kings wandering through the marshes for 30,000 years. We should not become silly. But it does mean that the earliest Mesopotamian imagination of rule, legitimacy, and pre-flood memory is inseparable from the theological sphere of the great serpent god. That is foundational. I have always found it revealing that the Mesopotamian world does not begin with abstract philosophy. It begins with place, city, shrine, water source, divine owner. Kingship descends. Yes, but it must land somewhere, and it lands in place already saturated with sacred depth. Eridu is not chosen at random. It is the house of the Apsu. The temple mound is already venerable by the time the king list is composed. Time accumulates there layer by layer, brick over brick, shrine over shrine, Memory over memory. You can picture the mound at dawn, a pale horizon over reed country, moist air moving across low ground, birds lifting from the marsh, mud brick walls holding the first light. Somewhere within the sacred precinct, water imagery, offerings, and the quiet seriousness of early cult life. It looks older, lower, closer to origin. The flood traditions thicken the atmosphere. Mesopotamian myth repeatedly places great flood between the antediluvian world and the historical one. Before the flood, kingship lasts impossibly long. Divine and human boundaries feel more permeable. Sages teach directly. The world is closer to its first arrangement. After the flood, rule begins again under altered conditions. Time contracts. Dynasties become more recognizably human. The age retreats behind water, and once again, Enki stands at the hinge. In the flood narratives, he is the one who preserves continuity through knowledge. When destruction is decreed, he warns. When the waters rise, he ensures memory crosses with the survivor. Civilization is not allowed to drown completely because the serpent wisdom of the deep intervenes. It means that Enki governs not only the beginnings of kingship in Eridu, but also the survival of human order across catastrophe. The flood comes, but knowledge remains. The old age ends, but sacred continuity survives. There is tenderness to that. And then there are the Apkallu. These antediluvian sages, remembered in later Mesopotamian tradition as culture bringers, teachers, and wise beings associated with the earliest age, complicate things further. They are linked to Enki. They belong to the pre-flood world. They mediate knowledge between divine depths and human society. In later imagery, they are sometimes shown in fish garments or fish-like forms, which has produced its own long history of interpretation. Some scholars see priestly costume. Others see symbolic aquatic beings. Either way, they reinforce the same old logic. Before and around the flood, wisdom enters humanity from beings tied to the watery, liminal sphere of Enki. The serpent theme never isolates itself into one narrow image. It keeps widening. Serpent, fish, water, hidden knowledge, antediluvian memory, sage transmission, kingship descending, flood survival. The symbols interweave. The more one reads, the more one senses that Mesopotamian religion is haunted by origins. Not in sentimental way, in bureaucratic way almost, which makes it even stranger. Lists of kings, lists of gods, temple sequences, cult centers, and each time the civilization refiles its own memories of how things began. The serpent-linked divine world remains embedded in the archive. This reaches an even deeper register when one turns to Tiamat. Now, strictly speaking, Tiamat belongs to the later Babylonian creation epic in its best-known literary form, not to the earliest Sumerian layers in the simple way popular storytelling sometimes suggests. We should keep that distinction clear. The Enuma Elish is late compared with the earliest Sumerian materials, though it draws on older mythic currents. Even so, Tiamat matters enormously for the serpent problem because she embodies primordial serpentine power at the beginning of divine genealogy itself. She is not minor monster. She is first mother, saltwater, house, birth source, dragon-like vastness. The text frames her as an adversary in the final cosmic war. Yes, but it also cannot erase the fact that the younger gods emerge from the primordial generation that begins with her. She is older than their order, older than their city walls, older than kingship, older than writing. The great dragon or serpent form is thus pushed all the way back into the mythic ancestry of the gods. Some readers are too quick to make her simply evil. The text does not quite allow it. Tiamat is dangerous. Yes, she births monsters. She resists the younger order, but she is also maternal, primal, and cosmologically necessary. When Marduk defeats her, he does not erase her so much as remake the world out of her body. Heaven and earth come from the broken mother. Rivers emerge. Structure itself arises from the defeated primordial form. That means serpent or dragon identity exists at both ends of the Mesopotamian divine spectrum. At the origin of cosmic generation, and later within the honored titles and bodies of major gods like Enki and Ningishzida. That continuity proves nothing literal, but it does show that serpent form occupies astonishingly central place in the religious imagination. Not peripheral, not accidental, central. When later Babylon elevates Marduk, the Mushu dragon becomes his sacred animal. Nebuchadnezzar II covers the Ishtar Gate with these creatures in gleaming glaze. Public, monumental, official. The dragon that earlier belonged in association with gods like Ningishzida and Ninazu now walks the walls of imperial Babylon beside lions and bulls. The form persists, adapts, transfers, but does not disappear. Dynasties change. Conquests happen. Theological power shifts. The serpent dragon remains. That is what makes the whole issue so stubborn. Temporary symbol fades. Decorative preference changes. Local cult image can vanish with its city. But this pattern does not vanish. It mutates and survives. From Ubaid figurines to Sumerian titles, from Eridu's sacred layers to antediluvian kingship, from Enki's wisdom to Tiamat's primordial body, from Ningishzida's shoulders to Babylon's gate bricks. 5,000 years of variation without erasure. So the old three interpretations remain. The first is symbolism. Serpents represent renewal, liminality, earth wisdom, underworld power, and hidden knowledge. The gods wear serpent language because serpent form best expresses their functions. The second is deeper metaphor of divine otherness. The serpent marks beings who are not human, not mortal, not entirely within the ordinary categories of surface life. The third is preserved memory, that the images and titles may carry some old remembrance of beings understood, in however mythologized way, as serpent, like in lineage or form. Mainstream scholarship generally resists this reading, often with good reason, because it attracts extravagant speculation far too easily. Still, the continuity is real, and the old Ubaid nursing mother is very real. we do not have to choose recklessly tonight. In fact, wiser response may be to remain in the pressure of the question itself. Because perhaps that is what the Mesopotamian material does best. It does not hand us an answer. It surrounds us with consistency. It places serpent-linked divinity so close to beginnings, wisdom, kingship, survival, and sacred authority, that the association becomes impossible to dismiss, even when its exact meaning remains elusive. And maybe that is the appropriate mood for history. Not certainty. Not tidy conclusions. A long gaze instead. A slow sitting beside the evidence until the categories we brought with us begin to loosen. Clay figurines. Temple mounds. Flood kings. Great serpent titles. The city of the waters below. Primordial mother shaped like dragon. Imperial gates lined with sacred beasts. None of it forces single answer, but together it produces world in which the Anunnaki and serpent beings remain bound to one another with quiet, persist force. The night in Mesopotamia must have felt heavy around such thoughts. Imagine the temple precinct after dark. Oil light moving over plaster and brick. Water nearby, not seen, but heard. Reed shadows shifting at the edge of the city. Somewhere scribe finishing line on clay. Somewhere priest reciting names older than memory. Somewhere beyond the wall, the flatness of the southern land breathing around the first city. And beneath it all, the Apsu. Beneath that, older silence still. It is in that darkness that Eridu keeps its secret best. The first kingship descends there. The great serpent god dwells there. The flood passes over the world, yet wisdom survives. Latter cities rise taller and louder, but they do not erase the claim of the beginning. They build above it, interpret it, inherit it, argue with it, but they never fully leave it behind. Eridu and Enki matter because they are the still center around which the later serpent theology continues to turn. And now, with kingship, flood, primordial ancestry, and sacred continuity all gathered into the same dim room, the question becomes more complete. The relationship between the Anunnaki and serpent beings is not some fringe footnote on the edges of Mesopotamian religion. It is woven into origins, sacred geography, divine intelligence, dynastic memory, and the idea of what survived the first great rupture. That is why the old clay keeps speaking after so many thousands of years. By the time the serpent pattern reaches Babylon, it has become almost impossible to dismiss as a passing religious preference. Too many centuries have carried it forward. Too many cities have preserved it. Too many gods have worn it in title, emblem, genealogy, or visible form. What began in the dim prehistory of the Ubaid world as silent reptilian-headed figurines has now crossed into royal theology, monumental architecture, an imperial spectacle. The old current is still flowing. It has only changed channels. Babylon, of course, likes to do everything in a larger voice. Where Eridu feels old, low, vet, and secretive, Babylon feels composed, deliberate, and public. Its theology does not whisper from marsh edges. It arranges itself on gates, walls, ceremonial roads, and immense literary compositions. Yet even here, in this more self-conscious imperial setting, the serpent does not vanish. It rises into new visibility. The dragon becomes official. The old sacred strangeness is not hidden away in some priestly archive. It is glazed in color and placed before the eyes of anyone entering the city. This is where Marduk matters. He is later than Enki in the historical development of Mesopotamian theology, but not separate from him in any simple way. As Babylon rose, so did its god. Marduk absorbed authority, functions, titles, and mythic weight from older divine figures, especially those connected to wisdom, kingship, and ordered rule. Theological centralization follows political centralization with almost suspicious neatness. The city becomes more important, and so its god does too. One can admire the myth-making and still notice the statecraft. And with Marduk comes the Mushu. The creature is not subtle. Long neck, serpentine head, forked tongue, scaled body, front legs of a lion, rear talons of a bird. A composite being. Yes, but serpent first in atmosphere. Furious serpent is one translation of its name, and the form is old. Older than Babylonian imperial confidence. Older than the blue-glazed brick that would later immortalize it. Earlier periods had already linked the Mushu with gods such as Ningishzida and Ninazu. By the time Babylon reaches its monumental height, the creature stands with Marduk. That transfer is not trivial. It means the serpent-dragon motif survives theological change rather than being discarded by it. New power inherits old sacred forms. Marduk becomes supreme, but he does not clear the older serpent field away. He gathers it in. He wears what previous divine lineages had already made venerable. If serpent imagery were temporary or incidental, this would be the moment we might expect it to disappear under the pressure of new state ideology. Instead, it becomes more public. Imagine Babylon now in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. The processional way broad and carefully ordered. The Ishtar gate rising in brilliant blue. Glazed brick catching light in a way mud brick never could. The walls breathing color into the dry Mesopotamian air. And across that blue surface, repeated with disciplined grandeur, lines of animals. Lions for Ishtar. Bulls for Added. Mushu dragons for Marduk. Everyone passing through the gate would see them. That is what matters most to me. These creatures were not hidden in a sealed chamber reserved for a select priesthood. They were not small enough to require magnifying glass and museum label. They were imperial and public, tied to the chief god of the most famous city in Mesopotamia. The serpent dragon was no embarrassment. It was state theology in brick. You can almost hear the sound of footsteps on the processional road. Sand shifting under sandals. Distant voices. Harness rings and fabric. Priests moving in ordered lines during festival days. The gate towering above. And there, again and again, the long scaled bodies and lifted heads of the divine creature. If you had grown up in that city, the image would settle into your mind as naturally as a flag or crown. Marduk's power would be inseparable from that form. And if you had lived centuries earlier in Lagash or at a shrine linked to Ningishzida, the form would not have seemed wholly new. That is precisely the point. The old serpent dragon survived cultural adaptation. This is why I think the Babylonian period is so valuable to the larger question. It removes any temptation to say that serpent divinity belonged only to obscure, archaic corners of Mesopotamian religion, things that later high theology politely outgrew. No. Later high theology monumentalized it. The deeper the civilization went into its own complexity, the more openly it continued to display serpent-linked divine imagery. And behind Marduk waits Tiamat. The Enuma Elish is later than the earliest Sumerian material, and we should be careful not to fold all Mesopotamian religious history into one flat mythic sheet. Still, the Babylonian creation epic matters because it places serpentine force not at the margins of divine history, but at its beginning. Tiamat is primal sea, mother of gods, source of the older generation, chaotic and generative at once. She is not merely a monster introduced for Marduk to defeat. She is what came before order. She is older than their order, older than their city walls, older than kingship, older than writing. The great dragon, or serpent form, is thus pushed all the way back into the mythic ancestry of the gods. That gives the whole serpent theme a deeper gravity, because now the dragon or serpent is not only sacred companion, sacred title, or inherited divine marker. It becomes ancestral. The gods arise from primordial waters personified through being with dragon-like force. Even when Marduk defeats Tiamat, he does not erase her importance. He builds the world from her. Heaven and earth come from the broken body of the primordial mother. The younger gods depend on what they overcame. This is not a simple victory of good over evil. Mesopotamian religion is too old and too layered for that kind of clean moral theater. Tiamat is dangerous, yes, but she is also necessary. She is the vast maternal precondition of everything. If later divine lineages remain marked by serpent or dragon imagery, one could say, symbolically, that they carry forward something of the first waters in their own sacred bodies. Some readers go further than that. They argue that the persistence of serpent imagery through divine genealogy suggests memory, not mere symbol. Mainstream scholarship rarely follows them there, and often for good reason. It is easy to overreach, but even the cautious reading must admit the structure is unusually strong. A primordial dragon mother, a wisdom god called Great Serpent, a line of serpent-associated deities such as Ninazu and Ningishzida, a chief imperial god marked by the Mushu. The pattern is far more than decorative. I have always found Tiamat's presence especially haunting because she turns the entire discussion around. People often approach the Anunnaki serpent question expecting a single answer hidden in one god or one figurine. But once Tiamat enters, the whole structure deepens. The serpent is no longer only something particular gods carry. It becomes part of the cosmological grammar, part of how creation, kingship, wisdom, and divine ancestry think about themselves. And then Babylon places that grammar on a gate. There is something almost serene in the confidence of it. No need to argue the image. No need to explain it. The city simply presents it. Marduk and his sacred dragon. Enter here under its gaze. Accept it as part of the shape of power. That is how old symbols behave when they remain fully alive. They do not apologize. They assume. This is also the point at which the relationship between politics and theology becomes impossible to ignore. As Babylon gathered older religious currents into itself, it did not merely preserve them. It reordered them around its own supremacy. Marduk absorbs. Marduk inherits. Marduk becomes the focal point through which older sacred forms continue. Yet this reordering still keeps the serpent dragon field intact. That tells us the field had too much weight to discard. You know that feeling when a civilization updates its symbols without ever really escaping them? Babylon has that quality. It may look newer, louder, more imperial than Eridu or early Sumerian cities. But beneath the polish, the old forms are still there. Water becomes empire. Marsh memory becomes brick ceremony. The great serpent survives the transition. And so the story now holds several scales at once. At the smallest scale, a nursing child with reptilian head in ancient clay. At the middle scale, gods like Ningishzida bearing dragons from their shoulders, or Enki wearing serpent titles in hymns and myth. At the largest scale, a creation epic in which Dragon Mother precedes cosmic order, and an imperial capital that places sacred serpent dragons before the whole public eye. That is not one coincidence. It is a civilizational habit of thought. Of course, habit of thought is not the same as literal memory. We should keep that clear. The evidence does not force us to say the Mesopotamians were documenting biological reptilian beings in a straightforward historical sense. It does not grant that sort of certainty. But it does force another recognition. If the Mesopotamians wanted to express some of their deepest ideas about divine power, origin, wisdom, kingship, and mediation, serpent and dragon forms were among their most trusted languages. Trusted for thousands of years. Trusted across political collapse and reconstruction. Trusted enough to survive every reform. That alone is astonishing. If you were walking with me now beneath the Ishtar Gate in the late afternoon, the blue bricks cooling as the sun lowered, the dragon forms repeating in measured cadence, you might begin to feel what all this continuity does to the imagination. The city would not explain itself to you. It would simply surround you with proof that for the people who built it, divine authority could still look reptilian, scaled, fork-tongued, and entirely legitimate. And from there, the final question rises naturally. If this pattern begins before writing, survives into the first Sumerian texts, attaches itself to named Anunnaki lineages, deepens through flood memory and primordial ancestry, and culminates in public imperial form, then what exactly are we meant to do with it? That is the quiet burden of the evidence. Not to panic, not to leap, to remain with it, to follow it one step further into the final chamber, where the three interpretations stand together without perfect reconciliation. Symbolism, divine otherness, preserved memory. The clay does not choose for us. The tablets do not choose for us. But they do demand that we take the serpent connection seriously because Mesopotamia certainly did. Even the silence around the evidence feels inherited, as though each age handed the question forward without ever fully answering it. By now, the room is full of clay. Not literally, perhaps, unless you imagine yourself surrounded by trays of tablets, figurines, seal impressions, fragments of glaze, and the patient storage hush of museum cases after closing time. But intellectually, yes, the room is full of clay. Fired clay from the Ubaid world. Inscribed clay from Sumerian temple archives. Monumental clay prisms remembering antediluvian kings. Babylonian tablets preserving creation epics. Clay carrying titles, genealogies, ghosts, flood memory, and the strange persistence of serpent imagery from prehistory into empire. If there is an answer, it must sit somewhere in that accumulated silence. And perhaps the most honest thing to say at the end is that the Mesopotamian material does not give us certainty. It gives us convergence. That is not the same thing. It does not hand us one neat declaration and invite us to go home satisfied. It gathers multiple lines of evidence around a central relationship and leaves us with responsibility rather than relief. The relationship itself is clear enough. The earliest figurines from the Ubaid horizon depict humanoid beings with reptilian or serpent-like heads, sometimes in intimate domestic scenes, even maternalones. Later Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts repeatedly attach serpent or dragon titles to major gods, especially within the Anunnaki world. Ningishzida is explicitly Great Serpent, marked in text and image. Ninazu shares the field. Enki, the wisdom god of Eridu, carries the serpent title and serpent atmosphere into the theological heart of civilization. Antediluvian kingship begins in Enki's city. Flood survival depends on his knowledge. Primordial ancestry itself is touched by dragon form through Tiamat. Later, Babylon makes the sacred serpent dragon public on its greatest gate. That is the pattern. The meaning of the pattern remains open. The first interpretation, and the one most widely accepted in mainstream scholarship, is symbolism. Serpents represent renewal, underworld power, wisdom from below, liminal movement, aquatic depth, healing, and regenerative force. The gods who govern such domains wear serpent language because serpent form expresses their functions with unusual power. This interpretation is coherent. It respects ancient symbolic intelligence. It does not ask the evidence to become stranger than it must. The second interpretation is slightly deeper and more unsettling. Serpent imagery marks divine otherness. The gods are not human. They may take anthropomorphic form in art and cult, but their deeper nature exceeds ordinary humanity. The serpent, or dragon, then becomes a sign of that beyondness, a coded acknowledgement that the divine world is bodily unlike us, older than us, and not contained by human categories. This still remains symbolic in broad sense, but it grants the imagery more ontological weight. Then there is the third interpretation. Preserved memory. This is the one academic caution tends to resist most strongly, sometimes wisely, because it can attract extravagant claims that outrun the evidence by several miles. Yet it is also the interpretation that refuses to explain away what the images actually show. what if the figurines meant what they depicted? What if the serpent-linked titles preserved not just abstract symbolism, but some cultural memory of beings understood as reptilian in lineage, form, or sacred identity? Not necessarily in the crude modern way popular culture likes to sensationalize, but in the older, deeper way myth and memory can preserve a form after explanation has been lost. We cannot prove that. But neither can we erase the question by simply calling it symbolism and moving on with professional dignity. The evidence has too much continuity for such easy dismissal. The serpent association is not occasional. It is structural. It is ancient. It persists with enough confidence that each generation of Mesopotamian civilization seems to inherit it rather than invent it. I have always thought that real historical mystery feels less like a jump scare and more like a weight settling slowly on the chest. This material has that quality. It becomes heavier the longer one sits with it, not because the evidence grows weaker, but because it grows more consistent. The clay keeps agreeing with itself across time, and that agreement stretches over astonishing distances. From around 5,900 BCE in the Ubaid world to the first millennium BCE in Babylon, over more than 5,000 years, serpent-linked imagery and divine authority remain entangled. Political orders collapse. Languages transform. Cities are conquered, abandoned, rebuilt, glorified, forgotten. Still the serpent survives. Still the dragon survives. Still major divine beings carry the mark. You know that feeling when a symbol refuses to die, and after a while, you stop asking why it remains popular and start asking what burden it has been carrying all along. That is the point we have reached. Perhaps the burden is theological. Perhaps Mesopotamian religion simply discovered early that serpent imagery was the best available language for expressing the most difficult divine realities. Wisdom, underworld, watery depth, primordial power, renewal, and liminal passage. If so, then the continuity is a triumph of symbolic precision. Perhaps the burden is older than symbolism alone. Perhaps certain sacred forms were inherited from the pre-literate past with such reverence that later civilizations kept them, even as the original explanation grew dim. The Ubaid figurines would then be not proof of literal reptilian gods, but evidence of very old sacred imagery whose force later writing preserved in title and myth. Or perhaps, and this is where the material becomes hardest to tame, there was indeed some remembered category of non-human divine being in the ancestral imagination of Mesopotamia, something that later religions stylized, theologized, and passed forward in increasingly formal ways. We cannot demonstrate that with certainty. But the fact that so many people continue to feel the pull of that possibility tells us something too. The Mesopotamian evidence invites literal curiosity because it never fully ceases to look literal. This is especially true of the nursing mother. I keep returning to her because she sits outside so many easy explanations. A throne scene would be easier. A dragon in battle would be easier. A serpent wrapped around a divine staff would be easier. But a mother feeding a reptilian-headed child enters the mind by quieter road and stays there longer. It does not shout myth. It whispers memory, or at least it gives that impression. And impressions matter when dealing with the emotional truth of ancient objects. If you were standing beside me in a museum storage room now, the lights low, drawer open, object resting in its climate-controlled stillness, perhaps you would feel the same thing. Not certainty, presence. A sense that this small piece of fired clay has outlived every explanation ever offered for it and remains just slightly ahead of us, waiting. The British Museum vault keeps the temperature stable. The humidity barely moves. Labels sit in their proper places. Catalog numbers bring order. Conservation notes bring care. Modernity has done everything it can to create a controlled environment around the object. And still the figurine carries its own atmosphere. It has not been neutralized. Ancient things rarely are. They come into the present under our rules, but they do not always submit to our categories. That is true of the tablets as well. Pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, the hymns and god lists and epics keep the old serpent language alive with unnerving calm. They do not sound like wild speculation. They sound like record. That may be record of symbol rather than record of literal form. But even symbolic record is revealing. It tells us what a civilization found central enough to preserve. And Mesopotamia found the serpent central enough to preserve again and again. By the end of this trail, the Anunnaki no longer appear in isolation from serpent beings. The connection is too dense for that. The question is not whether the link exists. It does. The question is what sort of link it is. And on that point, the material remains magnificently unresolved. Perhaps that is why it still matters. Some mysteries survive because evidence is scarce. This is not one of those. Here the evidence is abundant enough to establish the pattern, but not explicit enough to close its meaning. That is rarer, and in some ways more beautiful. It forces humility. It asks better questions than certainty usually can. It leaves room for scholarship, for restraint, for wonder, and yes, even for unease. The Mesopotamians lived in a world where the gods were not decorative ideas. They were present powers. Kings ruled under them. Temples housed them. Rituals fed them. Floods were remembered through them. Wisdom came from them. The dead passed beneath their judgment. And within that lived religious world, serpent beings and the Anunnaki were linked openly, persistently, and centrally. The civilization did not hide that link. It carved it, rolled it into clay, sang it, titled it, and built it into gates. So now the night grows quieter. The blue of Babylon fades. The marsh light of Eridu recedes. The seal impressions dry. The tablet edges cool. The old king list sits in its museum case, still announcing that kingship first descended in the city of the serpent god. Ningishzida remains at his threshold. Enki remains in his waters below. Tiamat remains behind them, all in the dark maternal depth from which divine order rose. And the Ubaid mother still nurses her reptilian child in perfect silence. You have heard the evidence. You have followed it from prehistory into theology, from figurine into hymn, from temple mound into imperial gate. No forced answer waits at the end, only the shape of the pattern itself, clear enough to see, old enough to humble us, and still unresolved enough to remain alive. That may be the most fitting ending. Not a conclusion, but a vigil. A quiet sitting beside the clay while the questions continue to breathe. The Anunnaki and Serpent beings remain linked across 5 millennia of Mesopotamian thought. Whether that link is symbolic, metaphysical, genealogical, or memorial in some deeper sense, the old civilization treated it as central. The objects endure. The texts endure. The serpent endures. And now the vault is dark again. The drawers are closed. The labels remain. Somewhere in storage and somewhere in glass, the ancient figures wait as they have waited for thousands of years, carrying into the future a relationship the past never considered strange enough to hide. The answers may never fully arrive, but the evidence has already spoken with all the steadiness clay and stone can offer. The question remains, patient and coiled, refusing to die, refusing to become simple, refusing to release the old world from its own long memory. Good night.